Despite all the uncertainties that come with being in a military family, there are some things that stay refreshingly the same. A permanent change of duty station will always be challenging. Another spouse will always be trying to sell you a product, and you generally trust the other military families who live around you. Timothy Hennis abused that trust and leveraged it to commit murder. Murder that he got away with for 25 years. This is Conduct Unbecoming. I'm Erin, and I'm your host. I have a lot of reference materials for today's case, and will include them in the show notes. Gary and Catherine Eastburn met in the 1970s and married in 1975. They had 3 daughters, Kara, born in 1980, Erin, born in 1982, and Jana, born in 1983. Gary Eastburn was a captain in the United States Air Force, and the Eastburn family received their next set of orders from the Air Force in 1985. They found they would be moving from Pope Air Force Base in Fayetteville, North Carolina, to England. Captain Eastburn would be a liaison to the Royal Air Force. But there was a slight hiccup. Dixie, their dog. Moving overseas is really challenging, and it's more challenging with a pet. There are a lot of tests and restrictions and quarantines to work through. The process to move our dog to Japan took a total of 8 months, between the rabies series, the blood draws, testing, and a 6-month quarantine. The Eastburns didn't think Dixie would tolerate the process well. There are so many considerations when it comes to moving with pets, and it's not always feasible to move overseas with them. Now, a quick plug for the military. The most recent National Defense Authorization Act, which is the 2023 NDAA, makes it easier for families to move with their pet, authorizing the services to reimburse the service member and their family up to $4,000 for the costs of moving their pet overseas. As crazy expensive as that sounds, it cost us about $4,000 to move our little dog overseas when we did it 4 years ago. Prices have only gone up, and they're much more expensive when your dog is bigger. In the days before social media appeals, the way to rehome a dog was to place a classified ad. The Eastburn family placed an ad for Dixie as they prepared to leave Fayetteville, North Carolina. Though Dixie was an English setter, it wouldn't be reasonable to take her to England. When the family placed the ad, Captain Eastburn was at a training at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. A young man, 27-year-old Army Sergeant Timothy Hennis, responded to the ad on Tuesday, May 7, 1985, at around 9 p.m. He shared that he and his wife loved dogs, but that their current pet, Snowball, was too jealous of their newborn daughter. Perhaps Hennis questioned where Catherine's husband, Captain Eastburn, was that night, and learned that he was away for a while longer. Friends, I listen to a lot of true crime podcasts, and it literally would not occur to me that I should be careful not to tell another service member that my spouse was away on training. The military community is really tight-knit, and these are people you can trust, although apparently not always. It happened a lot that I was alone those first 6 months we were in Japan. There were a lot of off-island excursions. I definitely don't want to misclassify them as vacations or trips. I lamented to anyone willing to hear it that I very much missed my favorite goober while he was away. Catherine Eastburn may have felt completely at ease, setting up Dixie's pickup after her young children were in bed. This would avoid the challenging goodbyes between her 3 young girls and Dixie, and it wouldn't have seemed strange to tell Timothy Hennis where her husband was. After all, this is someone who took the same oath as her husband. It seemed like the Hennis family would be an ideal fit for Dixie, a dog already accustomed to little ones running around the house. Before leaving the Eastburn home, Hennis asked Catherine to use the restroom. Then he clipped Dixie to a leash and left for home. 2 days later, on Thursday, May 9th, Timothy Hennis packed up his wife and daughter and drove them in their white Chevrolet Chevette to his in-laws' house. He claims he returned home after dropping off his wife and newborn, but an ex-girlfriend later explained to investigators that on May 9th, Hennis stopped by her house uninvited and unannounced while her husband was stationed in Germany. He told this ex-girlfriend that his wife left him, and getting no offers of sexual comfort from her, he soon left her home. That night, Catherine Eastburn and Timothy Hennis spoke by phone to discuss how Dixie was settling in. Early in the morning on May 10th, a tall, blonde, white man wearing a members-only jacket, white shirt, a dark hat, and jeans, exited the Eastburn home carrying a black trash bag over his shoulder. He ran into a neighbor named Patrick Cohn and wished him a good night. He climbed into his white Chevrolet Chevette and drove away. Later on May 10th, Timothy Hennis brought his black members-only jacket to the dry cleaners. In the morning on May 11th, Hennis's neighbors saw him burning items in a barrel in his yard. While Timothy Hennis set up his burn barrel on May 11th, Captain Eastburn eagerly waited near the dorm room payphone down in Alabama, waiting for the 8 a.m. phone call that had become routine for him and his wife. When Catherine didn't call on time, Captain Eastburn called the house but received no answer. As time passed, he grew more concerned and began to call repeatedly, but couldn't connect with Catherine. Captain Eastburn thought this was strange and contacted the local sheriff's department. They visited and left a note on the door, asking Catherine to call her husband. On Sunday, May 12th, neighbors began to grow concerned. One neighbor, Sergeant Seafelt, got home after bailing out one of his soldiers. I can't even get started down that rabbit hole. And when he got home, his wife mentioned that something seemed off with their neighbors, the Eastburn family. No one had picked up the newspapers next door, but their car was still there. The baby stroller was still in place near the back door. But when they knocked, they received no answer. But they could have sworn they could hear a baby crying. Peeking in a window, they could see baby Jana crying in her crib. It was then that the Seafelts summoned the police for a welfare check. The sight that greeted the police was unthinkably violent. I'm going to discuss the injuries to Catherine and her children. If you'd like to skip that, I'd suggest skipping forward about 30 seconds. Inside the home, the police found Catherine and two of her daughters, Kara, aged 5, and Aaron, aged 3, murdered. Catherine was stripped from the waist down. She'd been raped and stabbed 15 times. Catherine's underwear had been cut from her body and was found nearby with her jeans. Her wrists had ligature marks, which are pressure marks left by something that had been used to bind them. Kara, the 5-year-old, just a week away from turning 6, and Aaron, the 3-year-old, had also been repeatedly stabbed. Each of the Eastburns bore large cuts across their neck. When police entered the home, they found the youngest Eastburn daughter, Jana, alive, standing in her crib, arms outstretched and screaming. Though she was not physically assaulted, by the time the welfare check was conducted, by the time help arrived, she was suffering from severe dehydration. The medical team that treated Jana indicated that she was so severely dehydrated that if she hadn't been discovered, she was likely 8 hours away from becoming the final victim of this terrible murder. Everyone that could talk about what the murderer looked like was dead. I believe Jana, the youngest, was saved by her age and her inability to escape her crib. Investigators combed the scene and found fingerprints, hair, and evidence that someone had tried to clean up the crime scene. They did not find a murder weapon at the scene. A neighbor, Patrick Cohn, learning what happened at the Eastburn house, came forward to tell police about the man he'd run into in the early morning hours of May 10th. Patrick worked with the North Carolina State Bureau of Investigations to make a sketch of the man he saw. Police informed Captain Eastburn what happened and brought him home. And when he returned, they asked him to inventory his home, the site of his family's slaying, and let them know if anything was missing. Captain Eastburn did something I could not do, and conducted a painstaking review of the space in which the majority of his family had been violently murdered. He identified a few things that were missing: an envelope of cash, Catherine's ATM card, and a scrap of paper with the ATM passcode. The Eastburn's ATM card was used to withdraw $150 twice over 2 days for a total of $300. A woman who used the ATM shortly after the Eastburn ATM card was used told the police she saw a tall blonde man with a crew cut around the ATM at that time. There was no video footage, because again, this was the 1980s. On Monday, May 13th, 2 days before payday, Timothy Hennis cobbled together enough to pay his late rent, a balance of approximately $300. Hennis had 4 prior convictions in Minnesota and 1 in Fayetteville for writing bad checks, and he struggled to manage his money. His most recent conviction for bad checks was while he was stationed in Fayetteville. His last arrest was in 1983, which was about 2 years before the Eastburn murders. Finances were even more challenging, with a newborn to provide for. The police released the description of the man seen exiting the Eastburn house the night of the murder. They released the sketch that Patrick Cohn helped create. They announced they wanted to speak with the man that adopted Dixie from the Eastburn family on May 7th. Timothy Hennis and his wife were shaken by the similarities between Hennis and the composite sketch created. Timothy Hennis was 6'4", white, blonde, with a wide nose, mustache, and a crew cut, and they responded to the appeal for information on May 15th. After all, he still had Dixie. People would find him eventually. Police asked for and obtained Hennis's hair, blood, and semen samples. I spend far too much time thinking about murderers and rapists who didn't know about DNA, and how likely it was that they left a trail of evidence that we didn't have the technology to follow. When police put Hennis's 1983 mugshot in a photo array, Patrick Cohn identified him as the man he saw exiting the Eastburn home the night of the murder. Timothy Hennis was arrested by local police on May 16th for rape and murder. He spent 7 months in jail before making bail. Prosecutors kept a relentless pace. They had offered Hennis a plea deal prior to trial, which he declined. But they knew their case. They had reliable witnesses, and they had photographs of the murdered Eastburn family members to demonstrate just how brutal this crime was. The North Carolina jury deliberated for 10 hours and convicted Hennis on 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of first-degree rape on July 4th, 1986. Timothy Hennis was sentenced to death for his crimes on July 8th. A letter, dated the day of the sentencing, July 8th, reached Timothy Hennis in prison and read, "Dear Mr. Hennis, I did the crime. I murdered the Eastburns. Sorry you're doing the time. I'll be safely out of North Carolina when you read this. Thanks, Mr. X." A copy was also sent to the sheriff's office. If someone was actually gloating and not, for instance, trying to obstruct justice, I don't understand sending a copy of the letter to the sheriff's office. Following Hennis's North Carolina conviction, an Army Administrative Separation Board recommended separating Timothy Hennis from the Army under other than honorable conditions. There are 3 ways of leaving the military: administrative separation, punitive discharge, or retirement. A punitive discharge can only result from a guilty finding at a court-martial, and it's the most disgraceful way of leaving the military. Possible discharges include either a bad conduct discharge or a dishonorable discharge. Of the 2, a dishonorable discharge is worse and can only be awarded following a conviction at a general court-martial. Separately, a service member can be administratively separated, either voluntarily or involuntarily. The vast majority of service members separate voluntarily at the end of their contract with an honorable characterization of service. For those that are separated involuntarily, typically because they committed some amount of misconduct, the service member can be separated with one of 3 characterizations of service: honorable, general, or other than honorable. Other than honorable is the worst of the 3, while general is in between. About 6% of service members separate with a general characterization of service, and approximately 2% of service members separate with an other than honorable. Here, Hennis was administratively separated with an other than honorable, the worst possible characterization of service possible without a court-martial. The administrative separation was approved in the months following Hennis's conviction, on October 3, 1986. But the separation authority deferred execution of his separation, pending the appeal of his civilian conviction. In 1988, Captain Eastburn and his surviving daughter took the orders they'd received in 1985. They moved to a U.S. Air Force base north of London, and he became a liaison between the U.S. Air Force and the Royal Air Force. On appeal, the North Carolina Supreme Court ruled the prosecutors used an excessive number of gruesome crime scene photographs that prejudiced the jury. Hennis had already stipulated that the cause of death was stabbing, and the appellate court found that the nature of the photographs of the victims and the method of displaying them over Hennis's head during trial was inappropriate. In October 1988, the North Carolina Supreme Court ordered a retrial by a vote of 5-2. At his 1989 retrial, the defense team had a brand new strategy. It had been 4 years. Memories were starting to get fuzzier, and they could leverage the passage of time and degrading of memories to the defense's advantage. Lawyers for Hennis undermined the eyewitness's testimony. A friend of Patrick Cohn testified that Patrick had previously sent him a letter saying he wasn't sure what he saw the night of the murder. predictably, Patrick's friend didn't have a copy of this alleged letter anymore. You see, the friend kept this letter in his wallet, a perfectly normal and totally reasonable place to carry your correspondence around for years, and this friend had lost his wallet. The defense presented Hennis's professionally dry-cleaned black members-only jacket, which didn't have visible bloodstains on it. A new defense star witness materialized and testified that he lived down the street from the slain family, and that he was an uneasy sleeper with a habit of wandering the neighborhood in a beanie and black members-only jacket. He looked similar to Timothy Hennis. In this second trial, Timothy Hennis himself took the stand to make the case that it had to be someone else that raped Catherine Eastburn and murdered her and her daughters. He hadn't taken the stand in his first trial, and an alternate juror said that weighed heavily against him. A bizarrely clear memory of a letter that can't be produced, and a supposed neighbor who allegedly lived just down the road and liked to wander the roads. A neighbor that private investigators hired by the defense never talked with before the first trial. That not a single neighbor thought about when the sketch was released. That police didn't meet when canvassing the neighborhood after discovering the bodies. Is this enough to escape a murder conviction? For the jury in the room, though, it was. For the jurors, this was enough to create reasonable doubt, and Timothy Hennis was acquitted at his retrial on April 19, 1989. The case was resolved. Timothy Hennis was found not guilty of murdering Catherine, Kara, and Aaron Eastburn. As a result of the reversal, retrial, and acquittal in the state court, the separation authority voided Hennis's pending separation. He was released and reinstated to his position in the Army. He reported for duty at Fort Knox on April 21, 1989. On June 13, 1989, Hennis reenlisted in the Army. Captain Eastburn met and married an English nurse in 1991. After retiring from the Air Force, he worked overseas before finally putting down roots with his family in Washington. The Pacific Northwest is just about as far away as you can get from Fayetteville, North Carolina, and still be in the contiguous 48. Timothy Hennis promoted to Staff Sergeant, or E6, and in 1992, he and his wife welcomed a son. Hennis went on to serve in Operation Desert Storm and in Somalia, and continued to promote. In 1998, Timothy Hennis and his family moved to Fort Lewis, Washington. There, he became the scoutmaster of his son's troop. He eventually retired in 2004 as a Master Sergeant, or an E8. He retired honorably at 47 years old. He lived an entire life after his release from prison, and he and his family settled down in Lakewood, Washington, just 15 miles from the surviving Eastburn family members. 2 years after Timothy Hennis celebrated his retirement, investigators in North Carolina submitted the semen sample taken from Catherine Eastburn's body to the state lab for DNA testing. It matched with Timothy Hennis. It was 1.2 quadrillion times more likely to have come from Timothy Hennis than any other person on the planet. And here it was, the smoking gun. Timothy Hennis was already acquitted of murder in North Carolina, and the state couldn't prosecute him for it again without violating his constitutional rights. His right against double jeopardy. The only way to hold Hennis accountable for the murder of 3 people would be if a federal court had jurisdiction over his case. The military can recall a retired member back to active duty, provided such recall is in the interest of national defense, as determined by the secretary of that service. Thankfully, this includes trying someone for the murder of 3 military dependents. The Secretary of the Army ended any hopes Hennis had of getting away with murder when he approved recalling Timothy Hennis to active duty and reclaimed jurisdiction over him, even though he'd retired 2 years prior. On November 9, 2006, the Army preferred charges against Timothy Hennis for 3 counts of premeditated homicide. You may recall in the Turner case in Episode 3, we talked about dual jurisdiction and separate sovereigns. Namely, that if a federal court has jurisdiction and a state court has jurisdiction, it's not an issue of double jeopardy. Each sovereign has the ability to separately and even concurrently prosecute without violating the right against double jeopardy. And that's what happened here. Although North Carolina could no longer prosecute Hennis because of his acquittal, the military, as a separate sovereign, could still prosecute him. When confronted with the realities of science and DNA testing, Hennis now claimed that he and Catherine had consensual sex the night of the murder, which, again, was 2 days after he and Catherine had met. He had not shared this detail before, he claimed, because he was afraid and didn't want to add to the surviving Eastburn's grief. But this doesn't make a lot of sense. Timothy Hennis was on the prowl that night. His wife was safely ensconced and out of his way at her parents' house. His ex-girlfriend didn't put out, even after hearing the sob story about how his wife allegedly left him. But he knew where another woman lived. Not only did Timothy Hennis know where Catherine Eastburn lived, he knew when her children would be in bed. He knew the layout of her home. He'd just spoken with her, and he knew her husband was still away in Alabama. He knew she no longer had the benefit of a family dog to raise the alarm. Are we really to believe that Catherine met this man and then liked him so much that she proceeded to invite him back for unprotected consensual sex while her children were home? If any of his claims were true, Hennis would have had the most fortunate misfortune. He narrowly missed being killed by some supposed other murderer, only to have it all pinned on him because he'd had sex with the victim in the minutes before she was brutally murdered. Whatever the case, the U.S. Army prosecuted him for 3 counts of premeditated murder, not rape. The defense couldn't explain away the DNA evidence and the eyewitness testimony as successfully at this Army court-martial. The defense team tried the argument that all the DNA proved was a consensual relationship between Timothy Hennis and Catherine Eastburn, and that Timothy Hennis had no reason to kill Catherine and her daughters. I think we can all agree that his motive was silencing the woman he raped and the children who could identify him or call for help. Timothy Hennis did not take the stand at his court-martial. In 2010, a 14-member panel of soldiers, both enlisted and officers, deliberated over his fate for 3 hours and convicted Timothy Hennis on 3 counts of premeditated murder. The military has not executed anyone since 1961, and all executions require presidential approval. Nevertheless, this panel determined that death was the appropriate sentence for Timothy Hennis. He was incarcerated on the military's death row at Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. He is now one of 4 people currently on the military's death row. Timothy Hennis spent 25 years as a free man. He got to grow his family and watch his children grow up. While he made memories with his wife and his children, Jana, the only surviving Eastburn daughter, lamented that she was too young to remember her sisters and her mother. She said she found it difficult to mourn the family she couldn't remember having. Army, for today's safety brief, I have a reminder. If you commit a triple murder, the call of duty will be a siren song of justice to haul your bum back to active duty. All right, Legal Beagles. Instead of diving into any one appeal, I want to address them as a whole with you. Timothy Hennis has filed a lot of appeals, making scores of arguments. A death penalty case means there are, necessarily, a lot of appeals. The judicial system really wants to get it right. We don't deny someone their life without due process of law. Timothy Hennis, during his court-martial and throughout his appeals, challenged whether the Army had jurisdiction over him and over the crime at the heart of this case. Here, Hennis was on active duty and therefore subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice at the time he murdered the Eastburns in 1985. And he was also on active duty service and subject to the UCMJ at the time of his court-martial because he'd been recalled to active duty. However, Hennis argued that his break in service, which was a period of less than 24 hours in 1989, during which Hennis's enlistment contract concluded, and when he was waiting for his re-enlistment to become effective, prohibited the military from having jurisdiction over him, and therefore prohibited the military from being able to try him for the Eastburn murders. Under the 1950s statute that was in effect at the time of the Eastburn murders, if there is a break in service, like the break in service Hennis had, the military could only try a service member if 1. The service member was subject to military jurisdiction at the time of the offense, and at the time charges were preferred. 2. The offense was punishable by more than 5 years of confinement. And 3. No other state could try the service member for that offense. The first 2 elements weren't really at issue. Timothy Hennis was subject to the UCMJ at the time of the offense, and at the time charges were preferred. And triple murder is certainly punishable by more than 5 years of confinement. However, for that third issue, Hennis argued that he could have been tried by a state, as indeed North Carolina did in fact try him, twice. Therefore, he argued, the military did not have jurisdiction because the state could and did try him. The Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces, however, disagreed with Hennis's interpretation of the statute. They found that the statute applied at the time the military preferred charges, and was not merely looking at whether any state at any time could have tried him for the offense. The Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces found that in 2006, when the Army preferred murder charges, North Carolina was barred by double jeopardy. So in 2006, at the time charges were preferred, no other state could try him for the Eastburn murders. The Court of Appeals for the Armed Forces concluded that the military did have jurisdiction over Hennis and could try him for those offenses. Congress updated and fixed this jurisdictional statute in 1992. They removed the second and third elements. Now, as long as a service member was subject to military jurisdiction at the time of the offense and at the time of the court-martial, that person can be tried for offenses committed during a prior period of military service, or military service before a break-in service. One item I found really interesting is the whole butterfly effect that happened with Hennis's nearly completed administrative separation. If Timothy Hennis had been separated from the Army with an other than honorable classification of service, he wouldn't have been eligible to re-enlist in 1989. If he hadn't been able to re-enlist, the Army wouldn't have been able to call him back to active duty in 2006 when the DNA results came back. If Timothy Hennis hadn't re-enlisted, he would have gotten away with not just one murder, but 3. This case is remarkable not only because of the wild facts, but because of the dominoes that had to fall just so in order for justice to prevail. The Supreme Court denied his writ of cert in 2020, effectively ending Hennis's argument about the break-in service. This case's conclusion feels like the right outcome to me. There is no statute of limitations on murder, so it would be a little bizarre to conclude that someone who was nominally out of the military for less than a day could not be held accountable for the crimes he committed during his first contract. And a big part of my reasoning that this feels like the right outcome is also built on the idea of availing oneself to a jurisdiction. Timothy Hennis availed himself to all the benefits of military life. He was hired in spite of his numerous misdemeanor convictions. His family's health care was covered. He was not fired after spending 5 years in trials and prisons. And he earned a retirement from the Army. He literally signed up to be subject to the Army's rules, including ones that prohibit rape and murder. In exchange, the Army had jurisdiction over him and his conduct. They could bring him up on charges for violating their rules. Some, including Timothy Hennis, might say that this result flies in the face of double jeopardy guarantees, that he was acquitted, and that if he'd been a civilian, the best the Eastburn family could hope for would be a wrongful death civil suit. But I, for one, feel totally comfortable that this man who swore to follow the rules set out in the Uniform Code of Military Justice is actually held to them. If you enjoyed today's episode, please remember to share, subscribe, and rate it wherever you listen to podcasts. I invite you to submit case suggestions and feedback to conductunbecomingpod@gmail.com. Join me next time when we take a 27-hour travel day aboard the Patriot Express out to Okinawa, Japan. A warning: when you step out into the suffocating humidity, you'll feel the travel was neither patriotic nor express. We'll get through it together. Until then, take care.